There's a specific kind of afternoon that a lot of people know, but almost nobody talks about. It's not a dramatic afternoon. Nothing goes wrong exactly. You sit down at your desk, or maybe at the kitchen table, maybe with a cup of coffee that's already gone a little cold. You have your notes open, you have your textbook or your course material or whatever it is you're trying to learn, and you read. You read the same paragraph twice, then a third time, and somewhere around the fourth time through, something quiet and uncomfortable starts to settle in. This vague, low-level anxiety that you can't quite name. Not panic, not crisis, just a soft, persistent fog. You understand the words individually, you do. You know what each sentence means in isolation, but somehow, when you try to hold all of it together in your mind at the same time, it slips. Like trying to hold water in your hands, the shape of it keeps collapsing. So you do what most people do. You highlight something. Maybe you reread the section one more time. You flip back to the beginning. You tell yourself you just need to focus harder, pay closer attention, be more disciplined. And then, somewhere in that loop, you quietly open your phone, just for a second, just to reset. If any part of that felt familiar, I want you to stay with me here, because what I'm about to tell you isn't about working harder. It isn't about discipline or willpower or finding the right productivity system. It's about something much quieter and much more important than any of that. It's about understanding what learning actually is, and more specifically, why one of the most celebrated study techniques in modern education is being used in a way that almost guarantees you'll stay stuck in that fog. Let's talk about Richard Feynman for a moment. If you've spent any time in learning communities online, you've heard his name. Nobel Prize-winning physicist, brilliant mind, eccentric, curious, endlessly compelling. And somewhere along the way, his approach to understanding things got packaged into what the internet now calls the Feynman Technique, a four-step method you'll find on productivity blogs, study apps, and YouTube channels with millions of views. The general version goes something like this. Pick a concept, write it out as if you're teaching it to a child, identify the gaps in your explanation, go back to the source material to fill those gaps, and simplify until it's clean and clear. It sounds elegant, and honestly, it is. As an idea, it's genuinely powerful. But here's the thing. Most people who learn this technique, and I was absolutely one of them, miss the entire point of it. Not because they're careless, not because they're unintelligent, but because the way it's usually taught emphasizes the wrong part of the process. And that mistake, that one quiet misunderstanding, turns one of the most effective learning strategies ever described into something that feels a lot like the highlight and reread loop you were already trapped in, just with slightly better aesthetics. Here's what most tutorials tell you the Feynman technique is about: simplification. Explain it simply, find the gaps, fill the gaps, simplify again. The emphasis lands on the output, on the explanation, on producing something clear. And so, most people sit down, read through their material, and then try to write out a simple explanation of it. They describe the concept back in plain language, they feel reasonably satisfied with what they've written, and they move on. What they've done, without realizing it, is confused fluency with understanding. Cognitive psychologists have a name for this. They call it the illusion of knowing. It's the experience of recognizing something and mistaking that recognition for deep comprehension. When you read a concept you've seen before, your brain produces a feeling of familiarity. That feeling is warm and convincing. It feels like understanding. It feels like you've got it. But familiarity and understanding are not the same thing, not even close. Reading your notes and feeling like you understand them is a little like watching someone else swim and thinking you know how to swim. The information is entering your eyes. You are processing it, but you are not inside it. You are not moving through it. You are watching from the shore. The Feynman technique was never meant to be a way of producing a clean explanation. It was meant to be a way of exposing the exact moment when your explanation breaks down, and then sitting with that discomfort long enough to actually understand why. Feynman himself was obsessed with that moment of breakdown. He had this phrase he used: if you can't explain something simply, you don't understand it well enough. But what gets lost in translation is that this wasn't a productivity tip, it was a philosophy of intellectual honesty. He wasn't saying, simplify so that you feel smart. He was saying, the moment your explanation stutters, that stutter is the most important thing in the room.
The psychology underneath. So why do most people skip the stutter? Because sitting with confusion is genuinely uncomfortable. And the human brain, as sophisticated as it is, has a deeply wired preference for closing open loops rather than sitting inside them. There's a term in psychology, the Zeigarnik effect, that describes how unresolved tension creates a kind of mental itch, and our instinct is to scratch it as fast as possible. We want resolution. We want the feeling of completion. The problem is that in learning, the resolution you reach too quickly is almost always a false one. When you fill in a gap in your explanation with vague language, with phrases like, and then it basically works like, or so you sort of combine the two things, your brain registers that as a completed thought. The loop closes, the itch is scratched, but the gap is still there. You've just covered it with softer words. This is why the technique fails for most people. They perform the steps, but they perform them in a way that minimizes the very discomfort the technique was designed to produce. Think about it this way. Imagine you're a sculptor working on a marble figure. The Feynman technique is not about finishing the sculpture quickly. It's about running your hands across the stone and feeling every rough patch, every uneven surface, every place where the form hasn't yet resolved. The whole point is to feel where the work still needs to happen. But if you're moving too fast, if you're trying to get to the finished product, you'll smooth over those rough patches with sandpaper and call it done. The shape will look fine from a distance, but it won't hold up under close inspection. The version of the Feynman technique most people use is sandpaper. The real version is your bare hands on uncut stone. Now, I want to offer you something that goes a little deeper than study technique, because I think there's a reason most people rush through the uncomfortable part. And it's not laziness, it's not lack of discipline. It's something more personal than that. When your explanation breaks down, when you're trying to teach a concept out loud or on paper and you suddenly find you don't actually know what comes next, there's a split second of experience that most people don't examine closely. It's a small moment of exposure, a quiet internal voice that says, maybe I don't actually get this. Maybe I'm not as smart as I thought. Maybe I've been nodding along this whole time and not actually understanding anything. That voice is not your enemy, but it can become one if you never look at it directly. Carl Jung wrote about the shadow, the parts of ourselves we prefer not to examine. In the context of learning, the shadow is everything we're afraid might be true about our own intelligence. The fear that we're slower than we should be, that the material is beyond us, that everyone else in the class understood it the first time, and we're the only ones sitting here reading the same paragraph over and over again. And the fascinating thing is that this fear is nearly universal. Studies on academic anxiety consistently show that students across all ability levels experience versions of this doubt. The students who perform best are not the ones who feel no uncertainty. They're the ones who've learned to tolerate it without running from it. This is what William James was pointing at when he talked about the will to believe, not as a religious concept, but a psychological one. What we believe about ourselves in moments of difficulty determines what we do next. The student who encounters confusion and thinks, this means I'm not smart enough, closes down. The student who encounters confusion and thinks, this is where the actual learning is, opens up. The Feynman technique, done correctly, is a practice in the second kind of thinking. So let me describe what using the technique correctly actually looks like, not as a set of steps to follow, but as a quality of attention to bring. You pick a concept, and instead of reading it until it feels familiar, you close the book, you close the notes, you take a blank piece of paper, and you try to reconstruct it from memory. Not a polished explanation, not a beautiful summary, just whatever is actually in your head right now. And then you let it be rough. You let the explanation stutter. You let it trail off into, I know there's something here about, and I think this connects to that, but I'm not sure how. You don't clean it up. You don't make it sound intelligent. You just let it be honest. And that honesty, that unedited, slightly embarrassing first draft of your understanding, is the most valuable thing you will produce in your study session. Because every place you write something vague, every place you write basically or sort of or in some way, that's a flag. That's your brain telling you with remarkable precision exactly where the real work needs to happen. Then, and only then, do you go back to the source, not to reread everything, just to address the specific places that broke down. This is the part that makes it efficient. You are not reviewing, you are repairing. And here's what happens when you do this consistently. Over time, you build what learning scientists call durable encoding, memory structures that are robust precisely because they were formed through effortful retrieval rather than passive exposure. The struggle you experienced while reconstructing the concept from scratch, that cognitive friction, is not a sign that the technique isn't working. It is the technique working. The brain, much like a muscle, develops its strength not in the moments of ease, but in the moments of resistance. Neuroplasticity, the brain's capacity to rewire and strengthen its connections, is activated through challenge, not comfort. Every time you push through the gap instead of skating over it, you are literally changing the architecture of how that information is stored. This is why spaced repetition works. This is why testing yourself works better than rereading, not because discomfort is virtuous in some moral sense, but because effort and memory are physiologically linked. The brain encodes meaning more deeply when it has to reach for it. Here's something worth sitting with for a moment, and I want to ask it gently. When you study, when you sit down with material you want to understand, what are you actually trying to prove? Not what you're trying to learn, what you're trying to prove. For some people, studying is secretly a performance, not for an audience exactly, but for an internal judge, a way of confirming that they are in fact capable, intelligent, worthy of being in the room. And when the performance goes badly, when the material doesn't click, when the explanation breaks down, it feels less like a learning problem and more like an identity problem. I'm not saying this to diagnose anything. I'm saying it because I think it's worth knowing. Because if you're studying to prove something to yourself, then confusion feels like failure. And if confusion feels like failure, you will avoid it. You will use techniques in ways that minimize it. You will highlight and reread and produce polished summaries that create the feeling of understanding without the substance of it. But if you can shift the frame, even slightly, and start to see confusion not as a verdict on your intelligence, but as information about where your understanding currently lives, then the whole texture of studying changes. You stop running from the hard moments and start looking for them, because you know that's where the real work happens. Marcus Aurelius wrote something in his private journal, not for publication, just for himself, that the obstacle is the path. It's become a popular phrase, which means it's lost some of its weight, but in the context of learning, it's precisely accurate. The gap in your explanation is not in the way of your understanding, it is the way.
So let me bring this back to where we started. You're sitting at that desk. The afternoon light is doing something quiet and indifferent through the window. You've read the paragraph 4 times, and you still feel like the shape of it keeps collapsing when you try to hold it. And now you understand something important about that moment that you didn't before. That feeling, that soft, frustrating fog, is not a sign that you're behind or slow or that the material is beyond you. It's a sign that you're at the threshold of actual understanding. The fog lives exactly at the edge of what you currently know. And the only way through it is not to read more carefully. It's to stop reading, pick up a pen, and let your explanation break down on the page where you can see it. The real Feynman technique is not a method for producing cleaner notes. It is a practice of intellectual honesty. It is the discipline of sitting with not knowing long enough to transform it into knowing. It is the willingness to let your understanding be rough before it becomes solid. And that's the emotionally resonant truth I want to leave you with. Understanding is not something you receive. It's something you construct, and you can only build it in the places where you're willing to admit that it isn't there yet. That's it. That's the whole thing. If this landed somewhere real for you, I want to offer you something. The questions this video raises don't stop here. Why do we avoid the hard parts of learning? What else are we avoiding when we reach for the phone instead of sitting with the confusion? How much of what we call procrastination is actually something else entirely? Something more nuanced, more psychological, more worth understanding than the word procrastination can hold? Those are the questions this channel exists to explore. Not to fix you, not to optimize you, but to help you understand yourself more clearly. Because clarity, quiet and earned, is one of the most useful things a person can have. The next video continues exactly where this one leaves off.